Hello and welcome to the Final Frontiersmen, a YouTube channel about all things Trek. I'm Bill, and today we are looking at the last of the 4 Quadrant Sourcebooks for Star Trek Adventures role-playing game, first edition now, by Modiphius. As with all of our reviews, we are using the alert system. Yellow alerts are for things that you might be interested in. Red alerts are for the things that we think are great. And the rarely used black alerts are for things that are game-changing. So let's get into this. I will jump into the small window. And let's get started on the review of the Star Trek Adventures Delta Quadrant Sourcebook. So we're going to kick this review off with a yellow alert right away. Before we even get to the first page, on the inside cover, front and back covers, there is the homebound path of Voyager. It shows the completed path that Voyager took from its arrival in the Delta Quadrant until it reached the end with the Borg transwarp hub and returned to Earth. Spoilers. And it also has individual sections breaking down pretty much by season the distances that they covered. It's really cool. If you're a Voyager fan, it's a great way of seeing exactly how they got back and where they went in that region of the Delta Quadrant. So this book, again, this is an early first edition book where it was still using that standard timeline of where it was setting the living campaign in. This book moved that timeline forward to the year 2379, which is 8 years after what starts in the core rulebook. So this is pretty much the largest jump forward, and I think it might be the final jump forward before the book started taking on a more timeline-free aspect that is now carrying over into second edition. But if you're following the living campaign, and if you're following that, this jumps 8 years ahead to 2379. And before I go even further, here comes a second yellow alert. One thing I found really interesting in the opening chapter, every book usually has a little sidebar called Yesterday's Enterprise, where it talks about how to incorporate the material found inside the book in different timelines, because such as the Delta Quadrant, that's taken place, or I should say most of the information is coming from Voyager. So how can you incorporate this into an Enterprise campaign? How can you incorporate it into a TOS campaign? This might be the most detailed Yesterday's Enterprise sidebar out of any of the books in Star Trek Adventures. Don't quote me on that, but from my memory, this is one of the most robust and in-depth Yesterday's Enterprise sections to tell you really how to use the Delta Quadrant, especially in pre-Next Generation eras, pre-Voyager eras. So if you're not sure how you're going to be able to incorporate the stuff found in this book, you might want to take a look at that, and that's right there in the opening chapter. Double yellow alert even before we get into the real meat of it. So the meat, as always, starts in Chapter 2. So, going into Chapter 2, Chapter 2 is the Delta Quadrant. And this is going to be the most of the material in the book about this whole entire section of space, Delta Quadrant. So, it starts off going on with the inhabitants of the Delta Quadrant, and it's short entries for pretty much the majority or the big names of the different polities that the Voyager encountered as it was on its path. So the inhabitants that it talks about in this chapter, checking my notes, there's the Devore Imperium, the Hakonian Order, the Hierarchy, the Hirogen, the Kazon Order, Krenim Imperium, the Malon Cooperative, Species 8472, the Srivani, the Swarm, Talaxians, the Vadwar Imperium, Vidian Sodality, and the Voth. So a lot of big names, a lot of major entities throughout the 7 years of Voyager. They get some entries to elaborate on those societies in this section. It then goes on to talk about stellar and spatial phenomenon. Some of the highlights in this section that I wrote down to point out to you are chaotic space, the Necrid expanse, underspace, omega molecules, and fluidic space. Oh, and also the void too. There's a lot more too. There's other ones as well, but these are some of the more interesting concepts that were brought up in Voyager, some of the more scientific, stellar, spatial scenarios that the ship faced in the series. So you can find out details about them there and how you might be able to incorporate that in your game, even if you're not in the Delta Quadrant. Similar stellar phenomenon, similar spatial phenomena you could use elsewhere in the galaxy. Next to that, it has worlds of the Delta Quadrant. So worlds are, again, some highlights. Let's see, the Demon Planet, where Voyager was copied by the Silverbloods. Telex, what else? Oh, yeah, there's, I would say, I don't know if it's a negative point, but I would say that a lot of the entries are kind of sparse because, as you know, Voyager was on a constant path towards home, so it never really had a lot of time to really expand on any one world or any one section of space too much. And I think that's reflected here. Like I said, Demon Planet and Telex, they stand out to me. There are other entries as well, but they're maybe a little more sparse, especially when you compare them to entries in the core rulebook, in the Alpha Quadrant Sourcebook, in the Beta Quadrant Sourcebook, where you get planets that are visited frequently again and again and again. But again, Delta Quadrant, so it's pretty interesting to have these new worlds that are not seen elsewhere. That's in this chapter. The next part, Red Alert. We're getting started now. The Borg Collective. So this is a very detailed section, and I mean that. It's a very detailed section about the structure of the Borg Queen, and so much more. It gives you a very, very detailed and elaborate overview about many of the things found in this section. Again, I said it in many reviews before, a lot of these books, especially the early books, have a lot of sidebars. Most of them, many of them I should say, are written in universe as people filing reports, sending transmissions and that. It gives a little bit of flavor, and it's also packed full of story hooks. This section is no different. There's a lot of in-universe reports, logs, transmissions, whatever, from various polities and their encounters with the Borg and what it was like for their culture to experience it, or what they observed about the Borg. Really, really exciting stuff. Get used to me saying Borg. If you're doing a drinking game, you're probably going to be passed out before halfway point. The Borg are going to take center stage very, very soon. Well, actually, pretty much from this point forward. So it goes into drone types. There's also about disconnected drones and liberated drones. So it starts breaking down the different types of drones that are encountered throughout the series. And in more recent series, such as Star Trek Picard, we get even more detail about it that didn't exist in Voyager, but this is a good foundation if you want to carry the story forward and also use what was seen in Star Trek Picard season 1, 2, and 3. Next to that, there's also Borg locations. So this one is a little more unique, unlike the previous Delta Quadrant locations or in other source books where it lists the different worlds and what they stand for. This section, very fittingly about the Borg, it doesn't list worlds of the Borg. Instead, it describes how the Borg make use of the different types of planets that they take over. So it gives you a series of traits, and traits again are taking center stage in second edition. They're getting a lot more emphasis in second edition. So something like this is going to be an easy port to second edition. So it gives you lots of traits for these worlds and how the Borg use them and how that would change the way that the world functions and the players would interact with the worlds because of these traits. It, in addition to the worlds and these traits, it also goes into the unit complexes that the Borg have. Their little hive structures that they have throughout the galaxy in critical locations. So it gives you some good detail on it. And again, it goes back into the queens and how often these are the areas where a queen is stationed, or there is a queen available to appear if she needs be. Really, really good stuff. Again, chapter 2, like all the other books, it is packed full of information. There's a lot, and this is just the start of the Borg here. So standing down, red alert, we're going into chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the species of the Delta Quadrant, and it provides you with means of playing as these species. As I always say, these are all found in BC Home's online character creator, so you could get access to them anytime, but here is where the majority of them first appeared, and you could look them up for your own reference and detailed information. The species appearing in this chapter are the Ankari, the Jai, liberated Borg, and there's also a very good sidebar about Borg implants that I do recommend you take a look at. The Lokirim, the Mari, the Monian, Okampa, Pendari, Sicarian, Talaxian, Ture, and the Zal. Those are the ones that appear in this book. As I said, you could get them in the online character creator, but if you want to read up on the lore, this is the book to get. Now, there's also another sidebar. We're just chock full of sidebars here. There's another sidebar here that talks about species as traits, and there we go again with traits. But species as traits, these are not full-fledged species for character creation in the traditional sense, but these include different types of species that are unique and unusual that Voyager encountered, and you could use them as a trait to a character that you're playing. These include the Silverbloods from the Demon Planets. They are the deuterium-based life forms that copied the Voyager crew and the Voyager itself. I keep saying the Voyager instead of just Voyager. Kobali, they are the species that they reproduce by taking the dead of other species and genetically modifying them into a member of their species. You might remember from the series. So these are two examples of species as traits. They're not full-fledged 100% their own species, but they are traits that you could apply to another character that you are running. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is Starships of the Delta Quadrant. And guess what? We're going right into the Borg, of course, because there's a ton of Borg. So Borg Octahedron, which is the diamond. They got Borg Probe Ship, Borg Tactical Cubes, the Borg Taurus, not to be confused with the actual automobile, and the Auto Regeneration Unit. These are described in this chapter. Outside of that, you also get stats for the Delta Flyer, the Talaxian Freighter, Kazon or Trabe Raider, the Kazon or Trabe Predator, Hirogen Warship, Hirogen Venatic, the Krenim Warship, Krenim Time Ship, Lokirim Aria Patrol Ship. Yeah, Lokirim Aria Patrol Ship. That's one thing I believe, if I'm looking at my notes right. The Lokirim Pavtil? I may have written that wrong. It's the warship. Species 8472's Bioship, the Vidian Warship, the Voth Palisade research vessel, and the Voth City ship. They are all detailed to various degrees in this chapter. And chapter 5, the last chapter in the book, these are encounters and adversaries, and we are going to hit yet another yellow alert. So on this is about exploring the Delta Quadrant. These are encounter seeds, just like in the previous quadrants. They are the prototype mission briefs. So it gives you ideas on how to run adventures in these areas, in this part of space. Now, the reason why it's a yellow alert is exploring Borg space, going into a lot of detail on how to incorporate Borg elements into your game or as a whole campaign on its own. As well as for the Borg, it's giving you stats on NPCs such as Hugh, Commander Shelby, who also made an appearance in Picard Season 3, the Borg Queen, and I'm going to double up here and call red alert on this section that it brings up here on ways of defeating the Borg. because the Borg should be treated like a force of nature rather than an opponent that you're trying to whittle down the health to. These are giving you the ways of thinking outside the box, of thinking creatively to take down an enemy that is pretty much unstoppable otherwise. Really, really great addition, especially for players using Borg campaigns or focusing episodes on the Borg. Stand down, red alert. Aside from that, other encounters that are included in this section are just other things that reflect what Voyager experienced on their way back through the Delta Quadrant, and it includes a lot of NPCs such as Anorak's Devore Officer, Hirogen Alpha, Hirogen Hunters, Kazon Warriors, even Maj Kala, Ocampa Elders, Ocampa Disciples, Species 8472, some Vidian Phage Carriers, and photonic life forms, among many others. There's a lot of really cool NPCs to pull out of here to use in your game, all of it reflecting what was encountered in Voyager series. So that is basically everything you're going to find inside this book. Now, in the Gamma Quadrant review, I said at the end that as much as I love the book, as much as I think it is a great reference that I enjoy reading wholeheartedly as both a player of Star Trek Adventures and just as a Trekkie that is insatiable for knowledge of Star Trek, it was a book that I felt was so hyper-focused on a small window in the Star Trek universe that it probably wouldn't be as useful to most players or every player. So I said that I couldn't recommend everyone buys it, even though I highly recommend it on its own merits. This book, even though Delta Quadrant, you might think that's even rarer because it's harder to get there. Voyager was thrown there accidentally. It's not like anyone could just get to these far off points in the Delta Quadrant, so it's probably just as hard to use. For the majority, yeah, those species in that. But why I don't say this book you should pass up, I will not say that. I think you must buy this book simply because this is more the Borg Sourcebook than it is the Delta Quadrant Sourcebook. You do get the Delta Quadrant info, but the bulk of the book and the bulk of the juicy details in this book are about the Borg. And I would find it hard to believe that there are many games out there that don't at least incorporate some elements of the Borg. You might not have them appear in your game. You might not have them be an adversary. You might be in a completely different time period before the Borg were even known. But there's probably going to be Borg somehow creeping its way into the plot, into the story. If not in the GM's mind, probably in the player's minds. So the more you know about the Borg and how you could use them, how you can tease them even without using them, how you could drop hints, how you could set up situations to face them, even if you're not doing it directly, this is the book for you. The Borg are one of the most popular, most enjoyed alien adversaries in all of Star Trek. So I think the majority of players out there are going to want to have this information on hand, even if you're not immediately planning on using the Borg. It is amazing. It is spectacular. It has really elevated the small Borg-esque moments I added into my own game, which, spoilers, may be coming up in a future episode. But this is so good. That's why I keep it a step above the Gamma Quadrant, even though distance-wise and access-wise, the Delta Quadrant is more difficult, far more difficult to get to than the Gamma Quadrant in standard Star Trek. As a Borg sourcebook, as a Borg resource, and just as an information source, this book is amazing. I do highly recommend it. I love it. I love all the books, but I find that this is one of the most exciting ones just because of the detail you get about the Borg. Okay. That's it. That is my review. And we are done with all 4 of the Quadrant books. And pretty much we are done with individually talking about every single first edition hardcover book, or at least printed book, for the majority. So this might be the last true first edition review of this channel. And thank you for joining me. I thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this was helpful to you. And I'll see you in future videos, and hopefully I'll be seeing you in second edition reviews whenever that happens. Who knows? But as always, stay safe out there, my friends. Live long and prosper. Peace and long life. I'll see you.